In Canada, we have this account called the RESP, the Registered Education Savings Plan. It's existed since 1974, and I don't think it's changed a ton over that period, which Dan, you're going to talk about later.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe since
Yeah,
1974, but not really much since 1994.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
there's been some. I was actually looking into this yesterday. I think the only change that I noticed was that there used to be no limit on, and we're going to get into this, but there used to be no limit on contributions prior to something like 1989. And then they started adding all these caps to it, and the caps haven't changed much since, which I think is what you're referring to.
Yeah, yeah. So as the name of the account suggests, it's intended to help with funding post-secondary education costs. The definition of post-secondary education is very broad. The way that it works is contributions to the account are made with after-tax dollars, and then there are matching grants that get paid into the account when certain contributions are made. Not on all contributions, there are some limits, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then inside of the account, just like with other account types like an RSP or a TFSA, once you put money in there, you can invest it. Most of the time. Depends where you open it, I guess. But if you open it at a brokerage, you can invest in stocks or whatever inside of the account. And the benefit of the RSP is that all of the growth in the account is tax deferred. There are grants too. I mean, that's part of the benefit. But for investing, the benefit is that the growth is tax deferred. And as long as the beneficiary enrolls in post-secondary education, qualifying post-secondary education, that growth is taxable to the beneficiary when it's withdrawn. So if it's like a parent funding the account, stuff is growing, tax deferred in the account. And then if the child enrolls in a qualifying program, the growth is taxable in the child's hands, which is pretty beneficial in a lot of cases.
Well,
It's
it's one of
kind
the
of
only
income splitting, really, is
exactly
what
it's
it
one of the
is.
It's
only
exact right.
income splitting tools we have, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the common misconceptions with RESPs is that you buy an RESP from the sales organizations that kind of chase you down in the hospital right after you've had a child. And that's happened to me, like, with someone who has a little bit of financial knowledge. Seeing it happen in real time was pretty interesting, but you're like, you just had a baby, And they come in with a folder that has information. And part of that information is like, sign up for this thing.
How long ago was that, Ben? Like, when was your child born? Because I know that was definitely the case 25 years ago, but I'm saddened to hear that it's still happening.
Well, most recently, my youngest kid is 4. So as
Okay.
recently as
that's pretty shameful.
It's funny because my daughter's 18 months now, and I was actually hoping this would happen to me because I've heard so many people.
Just so you would have an
happened to my son.
anecdote. Yeah.
Totally, yeah, and just so I could like roast them in the hospital about why they shouldn't be doing this to me when my wife's just given birth, but it never happened.
It might have changed. I seem to remember there might have been a legal case. I don't know. I can't remember, but I have a feeling that it might have changed more recently. But that is a common misconception that that's what an RESP is. But an RESP is just an account type. That is one way of accessing the account type is through these things called group RESPs or pooled RESPs. They've got a bunch of downsides that I think we'll comment on a little bit later. You can open this account anytime after the birth of the beneficiary. You need a social insurance number to do it. And then the person opening the account is called the subscriber. So they legally own the account, that's important for a bunch of reasons. Usually a parent or a guardian, could be a spouse.
Could be anyone. With an individual RESP, there's actually no restriction on who you can open it for. There's different types, which we'll get into, as family RESPs and individual RESPs. But I mean, most commonly, yes, it's going to be parents or grandparents opening it for children, right?
Yep. Then there's a lifetime contribution limit, $50,000 per beneficiary. That can go in at any time. Like, there's no annual limit on contributions. But where it gets interesting is that there are grants. So when you make a contribution, you do receive grants in certain cases, and those have an annual cap. So you get 20% of the contributed amount up to a maximum of $500 per year. So that's $2,500. Contribution gets the max grant for that year. And then if you keep contributing, you don't get more grants. If you have unused grants, you can mop up one past year of unused grant at a time. And then the total lifetime amount of grant is $7,200. And then there are some programs where you can get a little bit of an accelerated grant if you have an income below a certain threshold, but your lifetime grant amount is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
You want to explain the Canada Learning Bond, Mark?
Sure. Yeah. So there's the Canada Learning Bond, which is for children of what the government considers to be low-income families. So it's not a matching contribution. It's basically just a deposit by the government, but it does require an RESP to be open in order to receive it. But you don't have to make a contribution. So it's effectively a free deposit from the government for those under certain income levels. Do you know what the income level is?
For the bond?
Yeah, for the Canada Learning Bond. I don't have it offhand.
No.
Okay, maybe we can look it up. I can look it up after. But different provinces also have grants. Like I'm in BC, and we recently, like in the past 10 years or so, introduced something called the BC Training and Education Savings Grant, I think it is. And so that is for children who are, I think they have to be older than 6 years old to get it. And it's just an application, as long as they're 6 or over, I think. And it's a $1,200 boost. It's a free $1,200 deposit to the RESP, which is a great incentive. I think Quebec has one. I think, Ben, you looked at this, or Dan, maybe you looked at this in Alberta and Saskatchewan used to have them, but they've discontinued them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There a couple of other provinces have had them. And I think what they've realized is, they were really quite small. So they would throw in a few $100s. And I'm sure they felt that the cost of the administration just didn't merit it. It wasn't really, adding enough value.
Yeah.
Just to backtrack on the BC one, if I remember correctly, you have to apply for it when the child is older than 6, but younger than 9.
Right.
And
Good point.
yeah, so there's a bit of a window in there. And I know, like, for our clients here, we put their birthdays in the calendar that pops up as soon as they turn 6, and then we reach out and apply for the grant for that reason. Because if you forget and your kid is over 9, you missed the opportunity. So
it's weird, isn't it? Like,
it is strange.
Why pick a 3-year window arbitrarily between 6 and 9? Like,
yeah,
it's still a decade before they're actually going to use the money for anything. It seems like an odd way to administer that. But
well, these plans are so complex. It's sort of par for the course that the provinces add their own level of complexity onto them.
Yeah, fair enough.
So that was we have federal grants, matching grants. You have to make a contribution. We have a bond, which you get based on your income level, but it's not contributory. You don't have to make a contribution, but you have to have an income below a certain level, and you have to open the RESP account to get it. And then 2 provinces, BC and Quebec, have additional grants. Are those matching grants? Like they're contributory?
No, I mean the BC one is definitely not. Yeah, okay. You just have to have an RESP open. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and to be clear, the CLB, the Canada Learning Bond, it's not a huge. It's money, right? But I think it's is it $500 for the first year, and then $100 per year after that, up to age 15, as long as you continue to qualify from a family income perspective. So at the most, you're getting $2,000 over 15 years. Right. Which, I mean, obviously for a low income family who's going to have trouble saving for education, it's money, right? But it's not a huge. Dan, you're going to get into this later, but the cost of education is high, and $2,000 is not likely to be the difference between somebody being able to achieve post-secondary education and not, right?
Right.
Yep. Another nuance with a plan is that blood relatives or legally adopted relatives can share what's called a family RESP. Beneficiaries have to be under 21 to be added to a family plan. But with a family RESP, it's the same deal. Like, you get access to the same grants per child. And while the use of grants is limited per child, like you can only withdraw up to $7,200 of grant per child, any excess earnings in the account, that's earnings on contributions and earnings on grants, that part can be distributed to any one child within a family plan. So with a family that has multiple children, the family plan, I think, is generally just a little bit more flexible in terms of how the money can be used to fund education for the kids.
More flexible, but more confusing.
More complex. Sure. Dan, did you have a family plan for your kids? You said they're grown up.
No, we had individual plans, but we manage virtually all family plans for our clients just because they're easier administratively. But we do this every day for people who are trying to manage their own RESP, trying to keep track of how much contributions, grants, and growth is allocated to each child in the plan is not that straightforward. So it definitely takes a little bit of experience to be able to manage those competently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ben, you
Yeah,
got
that's a good point.
4 kids. You presumably got a family RESP.
Yeah, we have it set up as a family plan.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you can manage the complexity, Ben.
It's tricky.
Yeah. Well, yeah. My PWL advisor that helps me with all that stuff can manage it. Okay, so we have these the stuff going into the account. We have contributions, we have grants, we have bonds, we have investment returns, which are not being taxed, but will eventually be taxed in the hands of the beneficiary. And all of those individual sort of notional accounts, I guess you could call them, that exist inside of the RESP, they actually matter quite a lot for how it comes out, how the money comes out of the account. So if a beneficiary enrolls in a qualifying educational program, the grants and growth are paid out as what are called education assistance payments, EAPs. Those are taxed in the hands of the student.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for a student who has, probably a low income, probably some tuition tax credits, they're not going to pay much tax on those withdrawals. However, if they have a high-paying co-op job or something like that, they could end up paying a lot of tax. So we'll walk through some withdrawal, sort of a little case study later, but you do have to be a little bit cautious of the timing of withdrawals of the taxable portion of the RESP.
Mm-hmm. This isn't a problem anymore because of the new tax on split income rules, but it used to be where, again, I primarily worked with doctors, and most of them have corporations, and you used to be able to add your children as shareholders of your corporation. Mm-hmm. At least in BC, there's bylaws per province, but in BC, you would have children subscribing for shares of the corporation when they're kids, and then when they turn adults, you could just pay them dividends. So you could just split income from your company. It doesn't matter if they worked there or anything. So a lot of physicians had set up their corporations to pay dividends to their adult kids for school. So you used to have to manage the taxes on the RESP a lot more intricately because they had this other taxable income. That opportunity is largely gone away. But yeah, now to your point, Ben, everyone's got about $15,000 of tax-free income they can earn per year. You stack on the tuition tax credits, and it's often possible to get a lot of that RESP money out with little to no tax.
Yeah. And then the contributions that you put in there, so the grants and the growth are taxable. Those are EAPs. The contributions are PSEs. I find all the names to make this whole thing just like that much more complex. Like there are all these ridiculous acronyms for the types of withdrawals that are coming out. It's like just the structure of the withdrawals is complicated enough, but then we have these acronyms for them too. It's just like, man, this is ridiculous.
Not only that, but the acronyms both kind of mean the same thing, don't they? Like
I was going to say the acronyms
secondary
don't
education
really distinguish between contributions and growth. They both essentially are synonymous. So it makes no sense.
Taxable and tax-free. Like, make it easy, guys.
But it actually matters for how useful the account is. Like it doesn't make the account useful. That's not what I mean. But for it to be useful, you have to properly manage all of these different notional accounts inside of the account. Mm-hmm. Okay, you can make contributions to the RESP until 31 years after it was first open, and then you have until the 35th year after the plan was first opened to use the funds before the account expires. And that would have implications for how the money comes out as well. And if it's not used to fund post-secondary education, then there are a sort of another set of implications. The contributions that you put in there still come out tax-free, so that's nice. The grants are repaid to the government. And then the excess, which is the earnings on the contributions and the grants, you can transfer some of that to your RSP if you have room. You don't get additional room to put it in there. And as long as all remaining beneficiaries are at least 21 years old, and the plan's been open for at least 10 years. So it's not like super simple. Like, hey, you can just do this.
And it's a $50,000 cap per subscriber, I believe, on what you can roll over into an RSP, which is actually really interesting and favors jointly owned RESPs, right? Like if you have, like my wife and I are both joint subscribers on our kids' RESPs, that gives us $100,000 of potential growth that could be rolled into RSPs. If you're a single subscriber, then you only have $50,000 for the family that can be used that way.
There are some other provisions. What's that?
It's a pretty high cap, $50,000 of growth, but still.
Yeah, for sure. If the beneficiary doesn't go to school, or if they have a disability and don't use the RESP, the earnings can, in certain cases, be rolled into an RDSP, a Registered Disability Savings Plan. And And then if you have to take the money out, so you can put it into an RRSP if you have room up to $50,000 per subscriber. You can put it into an RDSP if certain conditions are met. But if you can't do either of those things, then the excess amount, the earnings, have to come out at your tax rate plus a 20% penalty, which is basically to account for the growth from invested grants. Like you earned money on grants that you had to pay back, and you also had this tax sheltered growth benefit. So there's a penalty applied to, I guess, sort of account for that.
Yep. Could be a lot of tax. That's like 73.5%, I guess, would be the top tax rate in BC.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but as you know, we've talked about, these are pretty theoretical. It's extremely rare for a parent to be put in a position where they have to do this.
Yeah.
There's enough other sort of exit strategies that's really the last resort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you can just donate the money too. I've never seen it, but I believe there's a clause that says you can also just donate that money to a registered educational institution of some kind. And presumably there's no tax to you. I don't know if you get any sort of tax credits or anything like that.
You don't get a tax. I've seen it happen once, and you don't even get a tax benefit. So,
Jeez. So these accounts are, I mean, like it seems unnecessarily complex, but it is what it is. But because they're complex and because they have all these funny little features, it turns out to be a pretty fun sort of optimization problem to play with. Like if you've just had a child and you have $50,000 that you could invest in an RESP account, keeping in mind that $50,000 is the lifetime maximum contribution limit, should you dump that $50,000 into the RESP and invest it, or should you contribute it gradually over time to maximize the matching grants? Because keep in mind, if you do $50,000 once, you get 1 year of matching grant, but there's a cap for that year, and now you're done. You have no more contribution room.
Yeah,
so you give up
no
a
more
bunch of grants, or you could contribute gradually over time to get all the grants. So it's kind of fun to play with.
Have you seen clients do that? I've had one client do that, dump 50 grand in day one. This would have been 2016 or so. And so in hindsight, that looks really, really good. But
probably worked out great.
100%. I think he went 100% into VEQT, 100% at global equity. So it's worked out very, very well for him. But I think most people aren't in a position to do that. That's the only one I've seen do it.
Yeah, interesting.
We do a hybrid strategy very frequently where we put in the 14,000 lump sum. That's the difference between the maximum contribution and the maximum amount that you need to collect the lifetime maximum grant. So you put in 14,000 the year the child is born and 2,500 every year going forward. You get the maximum grant and you get extra compounding on that original 14,000. Maybe that's and I don't know if it's optimal, but it's certainly a strategy that seems to make intuitive sense. Yeah.
It's optimal, Dan. We're going to talk about that exact strategy.
The gun. Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's that is optimal is hard to define here, but I think that is probably overall, when you consider a bunch of different stuff, that's probably the optimal strategy. But we'll talk through a couple different examples here. So if we assume that other registered accounts are maxed out, so TFSA is maxed out, RSP is maxed out. So while this $50,000 is waiting to be invested in the RESP, it's invested in a taxable account, taxed at the highest rate in Ontario in these examples. So I've got one little mini case here from Aaron Hector, who's a financial planner that we know pretty well, and he's brilliant. But he did a post on exactly this, where he looked at a 7% return as his base case, and he did look at a couple different scenarios, but 7% return is the base case. And he actually found that a 4-year funding plan was optimal, which is interesting. So that was putting in $42,500 in the first year, and then following that with 3 years of $2,500 contributions to make up the room. So it's even a different hybrid than your example, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
And then he looked at a bunch of different return scenarios. And in general, in his return scenarios, what you see is higher returns make front loading look better. So like your example, Mark, of dumping the 50,000 in and just getting great returns, that's going to look better than getting grants. And then if you have lower returns, the grants are more attractive because they're obviously guaranteed. Like you get those regardless of how low your returns end up being. So in Aaron's example, with a 7% return, and a bit of variation around that, it makes, he kind of finds that front loading looks pretty good. I did a model pretty similar to Aaron's. I did this last year. I posted it on Twitter. But I added a Monte Carlo simulation because I wanted to see the distribution of outcomes for the different strategies. I didn't do exactly what Aaron did. Aaron did a bunch of different variations of the multi-year funding. I just did the $50,000 or the one you mentioned, Dan, where you do the $14,000 up front and then the rest after that. And then I looked at the terminal wealth at age 18. So with a 7% return, similar to what Aaron found, I also found that front loading makes a lot of sense if you get a guaranteed 7% return, which you can't get right now. But when I ran it through the Monte Carlo, what I found is that the median ending wealth was lower for the front-loaded strategy, and the standard deviation of final after-tax wealth was much higher for the front-loaded strategy. So my kind of take on this is that once you adjust for risk, I think it's pretty hard to argue against getting all of the grants. Like, yes, you can show that front-loading makes a lot of sense if you can get a really high return. But because returns are not guaranteed, I think it's pretty hard to say that it doesn't make sense to go for the grants unless you're really risk seeking, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the grants are a hedge against the worst outcomes, right? Effectively. Correct. Over time. It's the difference between investing $2,500 a year and $3,000 per year over that time frame. So if you get lucky with your returns, like the client that I had, like great. But if you had done this in, I don't know, going into 1999 or something where we faced two massive bear markets and within a decade, like those grants in hindsight would probably have been really, really useful to be allocated. So it's, I think it just improves the worst case scenarios by getting the grants. So we did the same thing, like with our kids, we did that exact strategy that Dan described where we put in the 14,000 and I mean, not everybody can do this, of course, I respect that. But in my mind, the best strategy is to try to get the additional $14,000 in as soon as possible. And if it takes 5 or 7 years to do that, that's fine. But you've got time on your side to some degree by allowing that money to compound. So if you can't do it year one, that's fine. But try to spread it out. But you can contribute more than the $2,500 per year that you need to get the grants.
Yeah. Yeah. And you make a good point though, Mark, that you want to get that unassisted contribution, as they call it, that $14,000 that you don't obtain a grant. You don't want to put that in when your child is 13 or 14. I mean, you can, but I just think that it's not worth it at that point. You might as well either try to get it in early, and if you don't have the funds available, just get in the 36,000 that you need to get the maximum grant. And as we'll talk about a little later, that's going to be enough for a lot of people. Like that's going to get you very close to, the full amount that you would need to fund a 4-year undergrad education in many cases.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yep. Yeah. So we do that $14,000 front loading strategy. We do that for clients all the time, like you guys do, Dan. And we call it RESP super funding. That's our nickname for it.
Okay. If you have non-registered funds available, it's a great idea, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Okay. So the other side of the RESP that I think gets typically less attention than optimal contributions, which even itself is a pretty niche topic, but even less attention is paid toward withdrawals. So we mentioned some of the nuances around the different types of notional accounts that exist inside the RESP. But there's this question of, okay, so you do this, you find the optimal contribution strategy and you end up with a big pile of money in your RESP. Now what do you do? So Aaron Hector did another post on this, and I did ask Aaron for permission to talk about these posts for the record. He was totally cool with it. So there are two types of post-secondary withdrawals. There's the EAPs, the educational assistance payments, which are taxable, and that's from your investment returns and your grants, taxable to the beneficiary, assuming they're enrolled in a qualifying post-secondary education program. And they are fully taxed as income. Like there's no idea of dividends or capital gains or whatever. It's all 100% tax as income. And then we have the PSEs, the non-taxable withdrawals. Those acronyms still just drive me nuts. And you have a choice. You can choose between taking out EAP or PSE. So there are some limits on the EAP. It's limited to $8,000 in the first 13 weeks of enrollment in a full-time program, or $4,000 if it's a part-time program. And then after the first 13 weeks, there is still a limit, which is kind of interesting. If you stay under the limit, your financial institution is not expected to assess the reasonableness of the expenses. And if you go over the limit, then your financial institution may ask questions about, is this a reasonable educational cost? So that limit for 2024 is $28,122.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's up to the promoter. It's up to the financial institution to determine whether it's reasonable at the end of the day.
It does raise the question, though. Like, first of all, what's reasonable? Second of all, if you just happen to have, very high investment returns in your RSP, and you have no choice but to withdraw these larger EAPs, why would you be what is the consequence if you try to take a $40,000 EAP and the limit is 28, and you can't generate receipts showing that you spent $40,000 for your child's education? I've never seen that happen. I'm just curious as to what consequences there would be. Can the financial institution say, yeah, sorry, we're not allowing you to withdraw your money because you exceeded, the limit that we've set?
Yeah, I don't actually know. That'd be an interesting question to ask somebody that runs one of these programs at a financial institution.
Yeah, if anyone knows, leave a comment.
Yeah. And I think CRA can audit these. So even if a school or a financial institution rather says it's reasonable, CRA does have the right to audit all of these. So you could get, even if you took out 40 grand, let's say your financial institution says it's reasonable, in theory, CRA can audit your transaction, and then you would have to submit further proof of that. And then CRA does maintain, I don't know if it's CRA or the ESDC, but they maintain a list of expenses that are considered reasonable versus not reasonable, right? And so something that's interesting is rent to live on campus, like housing is a reasonable expense, but not down payments on property. And this is just with respect to the EAP limit, this taxable limit. So I've actually seen a case where somebody took out the full amount of PSE, their taxable, non-taxable contributions that they've made, and they use that to buy a condo on campus and then charge their child rent using the EAP withdrawals as rent for the condo. And then when they finish university, they just gifted them the property. So there's I think there's creative ways around it, but it's a problem that I think very few people will end up facing. And I mean, the three of us have never seen a case, I guess, where somebody's needed to make a withdrawal in excess of $28,000 per semester, or it's per year, I guess, that limit, right?
Per year, yeah.
Per year, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've come close to that. I mean, it's not that unusual, for if you supercharge your RESP and you earn healthy investment returns for 18 years, you could end up with well over $100,000 in an RESP, and that might require you to take out $28,000 in a year. That's not an extraordinary amount, but certainly we have never been challenged for taking too large of an EAP. So
no.
And it can happen when you have multiple kids and then one doesn't go to school. That growth has to be spread out amongst the other children, right? So that larger amount of growth, the more kids you have. So like Ben, if 2 of your kids don't go to school, you're going to have all this excess growth that has to be distributed to the 2 that do go to school.
Yeah.
I have a feeling your kids are going to go to school, Ben.
I hope so. I don't know. Yeah. We'll see. It's also so broad though. Like what qualifies as post-secondary programs? Like it can be trades, it can be like beautician school. Like there's a huge list of qualifying programs.
It's almost anything. Like the qualifier is that the program has to be. So I was going to tell the story later, but I'll tell it now. The qualifier is that the program has to be at least 3 weeks in length. So I had a client once, and they had a child that was going to take a 2-week bartending course. Okay, and so it was a couple $1,000 course. It was 2 weeks in length, but then there was a 1-week study period. And then there was a final exam. So from start to finish, from the day you start that program to the day you write the exam is 3 weeks, even though there's actually 2 weeks of instruction. And the ESDC maintains a list of qualified educational institutions. So if you're ever curious about a program as to whether it would qualify for an RESP withdrawal, you can just go look that up. And it's not just Canadian institutions, by the way. You can use this for institutions outside of Canada. Anyways, of course, we look it up. The bartending school is not on the list of approved schools. And I was able to call ESDC and say, hey, here's this scenario. And the program is 2 weeks, but there's a 1 week study period and then the exam. Can we make an RESP withdrawal? And they approved it. So anytime I get people saying like, oh, well, it's so restrictive, and like, what if my kid doesn't go to school? I'm like, anything they do to further themselves in any kind of career path is likely to qualify for an RESP withdrawal. Like, you just don't really have to worry about it. If they become a rock star and never go to school, okay, that's one thing. But I've yet to see a scenario where like we couldn't find something for them to do for a month to get the RESP money out, right?
Yeah.
That's very encouraging, because I'm really happy to hear that they're that flexible about what they consider to be post-secondary education, and it's not this narrow-minded college or university or that's it. So that's a good story.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, now so thinking about how to withdraw properly or efficiently matters, because we have this mix of taxable and non-taxable amounts inside of the account. We have limits on withdrawals, certain limits like we were just discussing. And then we have this issue where once the beneficiary is no longer enrolled, it's much less efficient because you have that penalty tax and the grants have to be paid back. So you really want to get this right. Not to mention stuff like tuition tax credits while the kid's enrolled in school. So what Aaron did in his post here is he looked at a case where an RESP has $50,000 of PSE, so that's $50,000 of contributions, and $150,000 of EAP, so that's grants and growth. So we've got a $200,000 RESP account, and Aaron just maps out what should you take out and when and what does it actually look like. So in the fall semester of the first year of enrollment in a qualifying post-secondary educational institution, Aaron shows taking $15,000 out as a non-taxable PSE, and he's going to put that in the TFSA and the FHSA, the first home savings account of the student. And then he suggests taking out $8,000 as an EAP, so that's the taxable amount, and that's the limit for the first 13 weeks of enrollment. And that's going to pay for whatever educational costs and stuff like that. And then in December of that year, so now 13 weeks have passed, Aaron suggests taking out $20,122, which is the balance to get to that EAP threshold, the $28,122 for the year. And that's it for that year. And then in January, so the first winter semester of the first year, we have $15,000 taken out as a PSE again, and that goes again into the TFSA and the FHSA. And then a $28,122 EAP, or whatever the maximum amount happens to be in that year. And he kind of does the same thing, cycles through a couple more times. Eventually the PSE is all used up. There's a final EAP for the $28,122. But then there's an interesting piece at the end where in Aaron's case, there was still a chunk left of EAP so the student's done their program now. There was still a bunch of EAP left. There's like, I think it was $9,000 or something that couldn't come out under that $28,122 limit. So Aaron's like, okay, well, this is a bit of a problem because now we would have to be able to justify the expense. So in his case, what he does is use it to purchase a vehicle, which would qualify as an excess EAP withdrawal, as long as the student's using it for transportation to and from school. It's kind of an interesting little point in there. And so in Aaron's case, the student ends up with, they've paid for a good chunk of their education costs. They've also got a maxed out FHSA, and they've shoveled $35,000 into their TFSAs, their TFSA. And yeah, so I think it's an interesting case, and I think it ties into asset allocation for RESPs, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, because in this case, a bunch of the money that was in the RESP has now gone into other investment accounts that could be used for long-term investments as opposed to spent on education costs.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts in here. I guess the one thing that jumps out to me is that you're contributing to the FHSA, presumably in years where your income is very low. Probably don't want to deduct those contributions and carry that deduction room forward, right?
Yeah, totally.
The FHSA, for people who aren't familiar, is the new first home savings account, right? So it combines the benefits of RSPs and TFSAs in some ways. So when you contribute to that account, you can use that to reduce your income. But you, like an RSP, you can contribute to it, but you don't have to use that income deduction in the year you contribute. So down to your point, in those low income years, you probably don't want to use that deduction, carry it forward to a year when you have higher income, right? The other thing is that limit, that $28,122, that's indexed to inflation, I believe. That's one of the few things that is actually indexed to inflation with RESPs, because I remember looking at that number a few years ago and it was something like 24,000. So it has obviously gone up, and I assume it's indexed to CPI, the consumer price index. But Aaron's example, I don't think obviously accounted for growth on any remaining investments or any investment income. So there would be like maybe residual income built up in the plan because you're going to leave it in a savings account of some kind, maybe as this is happening. But on the flip side, that EAP limit is also going up by inflation each year. So it's a very, very fascinating scenario. But Dan, to your point, quite complex.
Yeah. And I mean, I sometimes like to start with the simple scenario where you assume that the RESP is just going to be withdrawn in order to pay for school-related costs and not used to fund these other accounts. And one of the strategies that we will often consider is try to get those EAPs out as early as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you don't want to load up the student with income that's eventually going to be taxable. But the reason for that is if the child finishes a year or two of school and then drops out and doesn't go back, and we all know this happens frequently, you might end up in a position where you have to pay back those grants and face all of those penalties that we talked about. If you get all the EAPs out and at the end, all you have left is contributions, you can take those out anytime, even if the child no longer is enrolled in school. And I have seen this happen.
Mm-hmm.
Just experienced it with clients. So it's not a, zero risk strategy. So I would say, as far as possible, up to the limit where you're pretty confident the student's not going to pay any taxes, get those EAPs out in the first couple of years if you can.
Yeah.
Yep.
And not only that, but I mean, I've got clients who have students that enter co-op programs in year 3 and 4, and they make $25,000-$30,000, right? So the probability of their income, having other sources of taxable income, I find goes up in the later years of a program. So you want, ideally, from just a pure tax perspective, less EAPs withdrawn in later years than in earlier years, right? Crazy. Yeah, no, it's a super interesting topic. There's a few other fun things about RESPs that we didn't cover before we get into some of the other stuff. I mentioned quickly they can be used for qualifying programs outside of Canada. So that's another thing that I find people who are maybe wary of or concerned about RESP usage. They don't realize that. You can use them for certain educational programs outside the country, which is great. There are over-contribution penalties to be aware of, and this can get hairy when you've got multiple RESPs for one beneficiary. So I have seen cases where grandparents open an RESP for a child, for their grandkid. The parents also open one. Both are contributing. The beneficiary is the one that has those limits. That $50,000 lifetime limit and the $7,200 grant limit is per beneficiary, not per plan. So if you've got multiple RESPs with the same beneficiaries, it's very difficult to strategize properly, to optimize the way that we've explained here. And you can run into situations where you inadvertently over-contribute to the plan. So you have to be careful. And if you do, there's a 1% penalty per month, much like an RSP and a TFSA, on any excess contributions. The weird difference, and I don't know why this is, but somebody actually pointed this out to me on Twitter last year. With a TFSA, for example, the moment you over-contribute to a TFSA, the penalty applies for that month. So even if it's in there for an hour, in theory, you have to pay that month's penalty on the TFSA over contribution. With an RESP, that's not the case. The RESP, they actually look at the month end. So as long as you've withdrawn the excess contribution before the end of the month, which just brought up a really ridiculous strategy that I would never recommend to anybody. But I guess in theory, you could just the second day of the month, invest the money in the RESP, take it out on day 28, not pay the penalty and put it in on the first or the second of the next month. Don't do this. It just occurred to me. But don't try this at home. But for whatever reason, reading the tax forms for RESP over contributions, the wording is such that as long as the excess amount is withdrawn before the end of the month, there's no 1% penalty. So just to further complicate things, they've made even the over contributions on this plan different from the rest of registered plans, right? Yeah, and I think that's it. And then I just had that anecdote about the client of mine. They used it for a bartending school, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. One note, I'll jump in here. You had mentioned, Mark, about sometimes grandparents will open RESPs for their grandkids. That's a strategy we've been asked about it. I tend to discourage it. And the reason is that, unfortunately, the chances of a grandparent passing away before their grandchild has completed university is not remote. And If you are the subscriber of an RESP and you pass away, transferring that asset is not as straightforward as it is for many other account types. And so what I typically suggest in this situation is talk to your child and say, like, in other words, the parent, and say, we would like to fund an RESP for our grandchildren. We encourage you to open it up. I don't know, make it a holiday gift or something. You can fund it, but open it up in the parent's name as far as possible. That also solves the problem that you had mentioned about parents and grandparents perhaps both opening RESPs and accidentally over contributing. It's much cleaner if the parent is the subscriber, preferably both parents as joint subscribers if possible.
Yeah, that's a great point, because unlike other registered plans, RESPs are subject to probate, right? Like they go through the will of the subscriber. If you have an RSP or a TFSA and there's a named successor or named beneficiary, it bypasses the estate on death. That's not the case with an RESP, even though it's also a registered plan. And so if you haven't named a successor subscriber to that plan in your will, your executor effectively takes ownership over the plan and needs to find somebody to take it over. And if there's nobody suitable, the executor could just decide to distribute the money, pay the penalties, and deal with it. I haven't seen it happen, but to your point, it can get really messy with the estate too.
Yeah, and think about if the grandparent were to pass away, say just before or just after the child is enrolled in post-secondary education, by the time you get all this sorted out, it's quite possible the child being third, fourth year by now, and it's just really messy. So it's so much cleaner if you can just arrange it so that the parents are joint subscribers, whenever that's possible.
For sure. Could you open a joint account with the grandparents, like the parents and the grandparents? Would that help solve it?
What's that?
Could you open a joint?
You can't. No, you can have joint subscribers on an RESP, but they have to be spouses.
Right.
So this is another interesting point. This has come up with us before. We've had clients where the parents are separated, and they were joint subscribers, and even though they're both parents of the beneficiary, they cannot be joint subscribers once they are no longer spouses. So what we had to do was sever it. One parent became the subscriber, and they just had an agreement. Fortunately, it was an amicable separation, and they were just able to say, okay, your name is on it as the subscriber, but I will, be as supportive as I can, contribute some amount for the contributions, etc. So
interesting.
Adds yet another wrinkle into an already fairly complex plan.
Yeah, well, and I've got one where the parents are divorced, but each of them maintains an RESP for the beneficiary. So it was joint, they separated, but one of the spouses wouldn't give up their sort of control over the RESP, or both, I guess. And so there's actually two RESPs, but I only deal with one of the separated spouses. And so I have absolutely no view, and neither does she, on what's going on in her ex-husband's RESP for their kids. And now the kids are going to university, and so it's becoming very difficult, even for us as advisors. Like, where do we take the money from, right?
Yeah, crazy how many downstream implications there are with RESP planning in like estates and family law stuff. I think one important nugget in there that we can maybe be explicit about is that if you want an RESP account to go to somebody else as opposed to be distributed, it's really important to have a successor subscriber named in your will.
Yep.
Because that's not something that you can do on the account like with other registered account types.
Yep.
That's right.
And that's something that I've seen missed many times for people who have an RESP and are getting a will done. It's for whatever reason common to be overlooked throughout that process.
Yep.
Asset allocation, or do you want to talk about that other?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think we've probably picked it apart as much as we should for now.
If we haven't discouraged everyone from opening an RESP, we will soon.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, you've made the point a few times that like it's not as restrictive as it seems, and like it's a lot easier to use than it seems, and whatever. But that argument is used. I've seen it used at least in one case when people are trying to recommend permanent insurance instead of an RESP. That flexibility argument is often used where, that someone will say, don't contribute to an RESP, contribute to a whole life policy because it's whatever. It's you get tax-free growth, which is not true. You get, and then you don't have all these restrictions at the end of the plan like you do with the RESP. But like, yes, there are restrictions on the RESP, but they're not that bad. Like they're relatively easy to manage. I don't think it's I don't think it's a big deal. We have modeled that recently. Jason Pereira and I, for a project that we're working on, we modeled whole life insurance against.
Sorry?
That joke is so this guy named Jason. I don't know. You probably haven't heard of him.
Yeah, some guy.
So we have this project where we're looking at different cases for permanent insurance, and one of the ones we looked at is RESP versus whole life policy. And because of the grants, mostly, there's just no way that a whole life policy can match an RESP, unless you make some extreme assumptions about what happens at the end of the RESP plan, like, you know, all of the gains being given back, for example, which obviously wouldn't look very good, but that's not a realistic case either. Anyway, that was just a digression.
Well,
asset allocation for RESPs. So this is, again, it's another thing where it's surprisingly complicated for what should be a relatively simple account. We've talked about how the money's got to come out of the RESP for it to be tax efficient in a pretty specific time frame, like while the student is enrolled in qualifying post-secondary education. So I think one of the things that leads to people doing is thinking about their account's asset allocation as being tied very closely to when their child is going to go to school. And I think that can make sense if the funds in the RESP are going to be used to completely used to fund education costs. If you need the money in the account and it will be spent and given to an educational institution when the child is enrolled, then sure, it should follow some kind of glide path, because you're really matching liabilities with that account, like known liabilities. So Justin Bender at PWO.
That should be the assumption for most people, I think, right? I mean, again, we're going to talk a little bit about this. If you happen to be, you know, quite well off and are well able to fund your kids' post-secondary education and are just using the RESP as a kind of tax shelter, and then you're right. But I think it's fair to say that that's not necessarily the majority of people. And for most people who are opening an RESP for the reason that it was presumably intended, I think you should probably go into it with the thought that there should be some kind of glide path where the asset allocation gets more conservative as you approach high school graduation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in general. I just think that it's not the only way to think about it. And in our sample, where, like, you know, at PWL we tend to deal with fairly affluent families, the case of that's the second case where they maybe have other wealth or income to fund education costs, then the asset allocation doesn't necessarily need to be directly tied to the education costs. But I agree, Dan. Like in a general case for the average person, yeah, it still makes sense. So Justin Bender at PWL has a great post on this where he just kind of shows walking through that glide path where your RESP starts out at 90% equity, and then it decreases into incrementally shifting into bonds, and then eventually shifting into cash in the years before the student's enrolled. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. But then, as I mentioned with Aaron's example, in that case, some of the money was going into the TFSA and the FHSA, which, depending on what the money is going to be used for, could continue to be in long-term investments. So I think that could change the asset allocation target for the RESP account, because again, it's not actually being spent and withdrawn, so a little bit more volatility wouldn't be as big of a deal. Yeah, so that's kind of all my thoughts on RESP asset allocation.
So do you think in a standard case, would you actually get more conservative year by year? Like I haven't read Justin's post in quite a while, but does he go year by year, or does, like, in my mind, I would probably go, without looking at it, 100% equity up until they're like 14 or 15, like a few years before I started a glide path. Like, so you wouldn't start a glide path from age 5 and start getting more conservative at that point, right?
In Justin's example, that is what he shows, but that's not the only way to do it. I think just conceptually, you're wanting to get more conservative over time.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I personally would go more conservative earlier than that, Mark. I mean, just by our nature, I think, but I don't think it needs to be done on a year by year basis, right? You're 30% stocks this year and 25 the next year. And I think that's overdoing it.
Right.
But it's funny because when we talk to clients about this, I tend to not recommend the 100% stock allocation even early on. Or if it is, it's only for the first, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. I wouldn't go all the way to 14, just because, especially if they're not front loading it, right? If they're going to put in that $50,000 when the child's born, maybe. But if you're just adding $2,500 a year plus the grant, so like your investment returns are not really driving very much at that point because the dollar amounts are so small. It's your contributions and the grants that are really the most important factors. And so, you know, if you just use a balanced portfolio is probably,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or the least volatile way to do it. But again, that's just a stylistic thing. I wouldn't argue that that's the only way to do it.
Interesting. And it's interesting because we talk to clients about risk tolerance, and we use a risk tolerance tool that Ben, you and your research team built. But RESPs have always kind of not confused me, but been an interesting conversation with clients, because it's like, whose risk tolerance matters the most for the RESP? And obviously it's the parents, but their timeline is constrained. And at the end of the day, if this really is going to fund the child's education, even though you're the owner of the account and the child's too young to have a risk tolerance per se, but the risk tolerance conversation, which usually is the constraint on how aggressive you can be with the portfolio, becomes really fascinating in those cases.
Yeah, the time horizon there is more important than the client's temperament.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I'm triple leveraged NASDAQ in my RESP. I should start.
What is it? Four Qs? Is it
Q? Although I did find, apparently this is a total digression, but there's a 5x leveraged NASDAQ ETP. I don't know if it trades in Europe or something. I couldn't find it in Canada, but this thing exists. It's 5x NASDAQ.
That's a good RESP vehicle, I would say.
Super size RESP.
So, all right. Are you going to allow me to climb on my soapbox for a minute here?
Let's do it, Dan.
Okay. So this was actually kind of one of the genesis of this discussion that we had was, you know, I have a number of issues, I think, with RESPs, and, you know, look, there's no question they have a lot of benefits. We've just cataloged them. If you're a parent who can afford to contribute to them, you absolutely should. I did for my kids. I don't regret it at all. The problems I have are just a little bit more about the structure of them and some of the government incentives. So I just want to make a few kind of constructive criticisms, and hopefully somebody out there is listening. I mean, let's start with the first one, that I hope the objective of the RESP program was to assist families who would otherwise have been unable to afford tuition, and therefore, you know, increase the number of low-income families who are able to send their kids to school. If that is, in fact, the objective of the program, it's mostly failed. I mean, the research seems pretty clear. There's been a number of reports on this. RESPs are predominantly used by well-off families, most of whom would have probably been able to send their kids to school and assist them financially without the government's help. And you know, there's some obvious reasons for that. Obviously, well-off families have more funds available for RESP contributions, but it's not just that. Another reason is that lower income families may have less financial literacy, and they may just simply be unaware of RESPs. They might face barriers to opening the plans. They might, you know, be less comfortable dealing with investment firms or banks, and therefore those programs may not be getting to the people who need them the most. One sort of encouraging thing I was noticing that Ontario has now tried to address this issue by asking parents specifically if they would like to be referred to an RESP provider as part of their newborn registration service. So this is when you have a baby, you apply for the birth certificate and the social insurance number. And at that time, they will offer, if you want, without any sales pressure, because they don't have any vested interest, they will introduce you to an RESP promoter, either one that you choose. So you can go to them and say, hey, I would like to open an RESP with such and such an institution. And the government will then reach out to that financial institution and then invite them to contact you directly. So this is how they put it on their website. It says, you can consent to be contacted by an RESP promoter of your choice to learn about and to start to open an RESP if you decide to, and to request the Canada Learning Bond and or the Canada Education Savings Grant for your child. The service is quick and easy and puts the RESP promoter that you choose in direct contact with you to assist you to start saving early in an RESP for your child's education after high school. I think that's a pretty useful nudge. I don't know how successful it's been, but I like the idea, and we'd encourage other provinces to consider the same sort of thing. But I want to look at another issue with RESP accessibility. And Ben, this is one that you touched on in your introduction, and that is that RESP providers are sometimes what are called group RESPs or pooled RESPs. And these include a few different companies: Children Education Funds, Canada's or Canadian Scholarship Trusts, Heritage Education Funds. There's a few others. Now, if there is a benefit of one of these plans, is that they don't require you to work with an intimidating financial advisor, like Mark or someone here at PWL. And you don't need to have any investment know-how. You just need to sign up. You subscribe, basically. You make monthly contributions. You get all the bonds and grants that you're eligible for. They do all of that administration for you, and they administer the funds. So in theory, that's a benefit. But the problem is these plans have really been widely criticized for being aggressively marketed to new parents. Ben, you mentioned it. I've heard these stories for years, of course, of them going into hospital maternity wards and, sort of pressuring new parents to sign up. But even more problematic, I think, is the way they're structured, because these pooled plans are designed so if you subscribe and then you decide for whatever reason to cancel, the penalties are very high, and a lot of your money ends up staying in the plan, and it subsidizes people who don't drop out. And not surprisingly, the people who are most likely to drop out after subscribing tend to be low-income families, simply because they can't afford to continue the contributions that they had committed to. So here's a paragraph from a report about this problem. It says, redistribution of earnings on contributions from subscribers who exit the plans early to those who stay to maturity is integral to the design of group plan RESPs. There are concerns that low-income subscribers may be more likely to exit these plans prior to maturity or prior to their beneficiaries accessing the full complement of payments. This is a pretty heartbreaking report, I think, because it's like a survival of the fittest approach to education. I mean, this is hardly advances the goal of fairer access to education when it has, presumably lower income families contributing, dropping out, not benefiting from it, and then their money going to higher income families who keep subscribing right to maturity. This is a problem for me. I don't like the way that those plans are structured for that reason. All right, so then the next problem with RESPs I want to address is the inadequacy of the incentives for low-income families who participate, because there are some promising plans. We've talked about the Canada Learning Bond, for example. Again, just a reminder, if you're a qualifying low-income family, you can get up to $2,000 without making any contributions yourself. You get $500 just for opening the RESP, and you get another $100 annually until the child is 15 if you continue to qualify. The government even chips in $25 to help cover the cost of opening the account. So it's lovely. But we can all agree $2,000, which, by the way, has not increased since 2004, right, is not even enough to pay for a single semester of an undergraduate program. So I'm not really sure that this meaningfully improves the prospects for post-secondary education for any child in a low-income family. They might open the RESP, they might get a couple of $1,000s, but that's not likely to make an otherwise unobtainable goal any closer to reality. More than that, too, there's a significant obstacle in that receiving the Canada Learning Bond requires you to actually open an RESP. Now, that might sound simple for our listeners, but families with lower financial literacy are going to have more difficulty with this step, right? It's not necessarily as straightforward as those who are more financially savvy might think. And so there have been critics of the CLB program who have suggested that low-income families would be better served if financial assistance for education wasn't tied specifically to the RESP program, right? So there's different ways you could do it. The federal government could deposit the entitlement into some kind of notional account. This could be administered alongside the Canada Child Benefit, which is another income-tested benefit. So there are alternatives. Mark, I did want to say, when we were prepping for the show, you had pointed out that in the current federal budget, there was a proposal for something that might help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this was budget 2024, and starting in 2028, 2029, the proposal is that all eligible children born in 2024 or later would have an RESP plan automatically opened for them. And if they were eligible for the Canada Learning Bond payments, that would be automatically deposited into their accounts. And I believe it's done or proposed in such a way that if the child attains the age of 4 and they don't yet have an RESP, then they will automatically open one for them, right? So it does step in the right direction for sure, right? At least it's going to get some of that that Canada Learning Bond money that people would otherwise qualify for, that they don't know about, or they don't have the financial literacy to go and open an account themselves. That will partially solve it. But I mean, there's 4 years there where they're not going to be getting it in those cases. I don't know what institution is going to end up administering all of these. I don't know how that money is going to get invested, if at all. I believe just it'll probably end up sitting in cash or in a savings account of some kind. But at least they are thinking about the concerns that you've raised to some degree, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, these are at least kind of good ideas. We'll see what the execution is actually like. Right? But so anyway, so that's the Canada Learning Bond. We've also mentioned that the CESG grants, or the standard grants, they're the matching grants on your contribution, will get topped up for low-income families who have RESPs, but I see this benefit as pretty problematic as well. I mean, so here's how it works, right? When you contribute $2,500 to an RESP, you typically get a grant of 20%, $500. However, lower income families also get what's called additional CESG. So instead of the usual grant of $500, they would get $600. So again, that's nice, but here's the problem. To qualify for that full top up, your net family income can't be more than $55,867 in 2024. That number changes with inflation. And if your family income is greater than that, but not more than $111,733, you still get some additional CESG, but it's only 10%. So on that $2,500 contribution, your grant would be $550 instead of $500. If it's over that $111,733, you get no additional grants. So it's also important to, as Ben pointed out, these additional grants, yes, they can be obtained with smaller contributions if you qualify, but lower income families are not able to collect any more grant money over the life of the RESP. The maximum lifetime grant any child can receive is still $7,200, including the standard amount and the additional CESG. And so that's important. You're not getting any additional money. You're just getting it with lower contributions, right?
And these are tens of dollars that we're talking about, right? Like, to your point, a family with, income of say 55,000 or even under 111,000, they might not be maxing out an RESP. And if they're getting a 10 or 20% bonus on a $1,000 or $1,500 contribution up and above the grant that they would already get, we're talking like $30 a year in some cases. It's really meaningless at the end of the day.
Pretty trivial amounts. And even with the trivial benefit, I mean, let's look at these very low income thresholds, right? Households earning less than $55,000 a year cannot be expected to direct any meaningful amount of savings into an RESP. It's very unlikely that they're going to be contributing that $2,500 and collecting the whole additional $100 in grants, right? Most people in Canada, most families are going to have a pretty hard time just paying the rent and putting food on the table at that point. And so you have to be really low income in order to benefit from these. And if you are, you probably don't have $2,500 to put into an RESP. Right. And I mean, at the risk of, getting hate mail from seniors, I'm going to put my neck out here and say, the government is removing this very modest benefit from families with a combined income of less than $56,000, but it continues to pay old age security benefits to seniors until their individual incomes, not household incomes, exceed $148,000 in 2024. So I'm just putting it out there that maybe RESP grants could be calculated on the basis of income and reduced, or even eliminated for families who don't need them, but with thresholds that are more in line with those used to claw back old age security. So I don't know. I don't have the answers here, but I'm suggesting that maybe if you earn $200,000 a year, you don't get any RESP grant. But if you earn $50,000 a year, you get a very generous RESP grant, right? So then the grant money is going to the families who really need it and not just acting as a kind of additional tax sheltered account for families who don't really need it.
Interesting. And your number there on the old age security, 148,000, that's the point at which the last dollar of OAS gets clawed back.
So at that point, you're still getting some OAS.
Yeah.
You're not getting the full amount, but yes, that's.
Does that number presume you took it at age 65?
Yes. Well, I don't think it matters the age you took it. It matters the age you are, right? So if you're over 75, that threshold goes up because your old age security is 10% higher.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you defer it, and this is also something that Aaron Hector pointed out to me once upon a time, but if you defer it because your OAS is higher, you can actually have more taxable income before the entire amount gets clawed back, right? Because it gets clawed back at 15 cents per dollar. So the higher your OAS, the higher the income you can actually have before it all gets clawed back. So my point is that if you were to defer OAS, that ceiling is not necessarily 148,000. It could be, I don't know what it is, called 160, 170. You got a couple that's $340,000, $350,000 of household income, and you might still get a penny of old age security. To your point, Dan, people with $55,000 of household income are losing this tens of dollars of benefit.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's just a yawning gap, I think, between those two thresholds, and something that just really jumps out to me. If you want to get money in the hands of families who need it, and, let's face it, RESPs, funding education is an investment in the future, right? It's not just a handout. It's something that benefits everybody to have a more educated populace and workforce. So,
yep.
Right. So look, I've spent a lot of time ripping on RESPs and their flaws. I want to end with some more positive observations, because, as I said, I love the idea of them. And just because they have some structural limitations, it doesn't mean they're accounts that people should avoid. Let's start with the first one. If you are able to take advantage and you contribute that $2,500 annually, and lots of sort of middle income families can do that on a regular basis, and you max all the government grants, that RESP really does become a pretty significant asset. Even with modest investment returns, it's quite realistic. We see it all the time for parents to save $75,000, $80,000 or even more by the time their child starts university. And that is likely to cover most of an undergrad degree, I think, depending on what course you take, of course, or whether you live at home or what your needs are for room and board. But that is certainly a very good start. And I have worked with many parents who are really pleased to achieve that goal for their kids. The first time you have a child graduate high school and they look at that RESP and they say, do you think that's going to cover their education? And I'm able to say, yes, if not all of it, certainly the bulk of it. They're very proud of that financial goal, and they should be. So they're definitely a boon for people who have the means and the savvy to use them to their full potential. We did for both of our kids. They were a huge help in paying for their education. So, I think big picture, they're very useful accounts, right? And I want to say too, I think it's important, even though I've been complaining about how the RESP program has not really improved over the last 20 years or so. This contribution limit is basically the same as it was. That lifetime maximum grant has been $7,200, it seems like, forever. There's been no indexation on any of these limits. But I think it's worth noting that one of the reasons for that, and one of the reasons that the government has clearly stopped improving the RESP program, is because governments have introduced other policies that have improved access to education, tuition freezes, more generous financial assistance for low-income families. So they are in many ways doing the right thing. And as a result, Canada actually now leads all G7 countries with almost 60% of its workforce holding bachelor's degrees or higher. So we are doing a lot of things right. Just not convinced that RESPs can take too much credit for that.
Yeah, that's fair. I think the only thing that I can remember is this budget. Was it this budget or last year? They actually increased. We talked about the EAP limit in that first semester of being $8,000 for full-time school and $4,000 for part-time school. It actually used to be $5,000 for full-time and $2,500 for part-time. So this isn't really a big deal, but they recently increased the amount that you could take out as a taxable withdrawal during the first 13 weeks. not a big deal, but it's, some minor improvement to the withdrawal plan.
Yeah, because that $5,000 limit in the first 13 weeks was pretty limiting. I know that for a lot of times we would have preferred to be able to take more. Yeah, I think it seems clear to me that the primary reason that limit's there is so people don't game the system by, enrolling their child in a program, withdrawing all of the grants and growth, and then dropping out 6 months later. So, I mean, you could still game the system, but it's just a little harder now with that cap.
Great. No, very, very valid points and criticisms, Dan. I think, like, in my experience, I've never seen a situation where an RESP ended up being a bad tool in hindsight. I think, people people worry about some of the restrictions that we talked about that are mostly overblown and are concerned about withdrawal strategies and what if their kids don't go to school. I've not once in 15 years come across a scenario where with the client, we looked at the RESP when their kids were about to go to university and went, or even of university age, and went, oh boy, like this was a really, really bad idea in hindsight. So I'm just curious if either of you have come across bad experiences with clients and RESPs.
I had one, it just happened to us last year. Again, this was not something that I think in hindsight we could look back and say, well, we shouldn't have done it. But we did run into one of the limitations that we couldn't overcome. That was, we opened the RESP for the family. They have 2 kids. We contributed the max every year. I think we even did the supercharged 14,000. And then the family moved out of Canada. And they were pretty sure that, just for the record, you don't have to collapse an RESP if you move out of Canada. But if the child is not a resident of Canada, they cannot claim those benefits. So they said the chances of our kids going to post-secondary school while they're like moving back to Canada and becoming a student there was remote. So we just agreed we would have to collapse the RESP, and the usual things happen. We got the contributions back. Mm-hmm. We had to repay the grants to the government, fine. Yeah. But then all the growth on the investment, we could not withdraw. And the reason was the plan had not been open for 10 years. You'll remember that one limitation we talked about. And because of that, we had to just make a donation to a post-secondary education. So they were very grateful for the donation. No tax receipt was issued. So, worst case scenario, they got back their contributions. They definitely lost a few years of investment growth. It was some opportunity cost. I don't know. I mean, what do you do when you ask a family, would you like to open an RESP? Do you think, is there any chance that someday, years from now, you might move out of the country?
Yeah, or your kids might move out.
Yeah. So hindsight, I don't think there's anything we did wrong, but just to let you know, there can be situations where you end up disappointed that you have to dissolve the plan.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.